December 17th, 1944. The Amblève River Valley, Belgium. Staff Sergeant Charles Hensel of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion is alone at a road junction in the dark, and somewhere on the road coming toward him, he can hear the distinctive sound of German tank tracks on frozen Belgian asphalt. Hensel has been at this junction, the intersection of the N23 highway and the Trois Ponts road, for 6 hours. He arrived with a demolition team of 11 men whose assignment was to prepare the bridges in the Amblève Valley for demolition if the German offensive that has been rolling through the American lines since 05:30 the previous morning reached this sector. The bridges have been prepared. The bridges in the valley to the east have already been blown, in the specific and desperate work of the engineer units, who have been destroying infrastructure ahead of the German advance since the first hours of December 16. His 11 men are gone, detached to other positions in the specific and sequential way that the organizational chaos of the retreat has been consuming units. 3 sent east to reinforce another demolition team, whose position has been overrun. 2 sent to find the battalion headquarters, whose last known location has been in a farmhouse that the German advance has subsequently passed through. 2 lost to the specific and terrible misfortune of a German artillery round landing on the shoulder of the N23 while the team was moving its equipment. And 4, the last 4, dispatched north to prepare the Lien Creek Bridge for demolition, when reports of a German column on the N15 highway have reached Hensel through the radio that has since stopped working. He does not know if the Lien Creek Bridge has been blown. He does not know where the German columns are, except that he can hear one of them on the road to his east. He knows where he is. He knows what the junction controls. He knows he is alone. Hensel is alone at the junction with a carbine, 2 fragmentation grenades, the radio that stopped working an hour ago, and the specific and irrefutable knowledge that the tank sounds he is hearing are getting louder. The sounds are coming from the east, from the direction of the Amblève Valley's road that connects to the German penetration's axis of advance. He knows what a panzer column sounds like at this range. He knows the difference between the track sound of American half-tracks and the track sound of German armored vehicles. And the sound he is hearing is the sound of German vehicles, multiple vehicles, the specific and overlapping mechanical symphony of a formation, rather than a single vehicle. He does not know what he is going to do. He knows what he is not going to do. He is not going to move. The junction controls the route. The route controls the time. The time is what the American recovery needs. He does not think about it in these terms. He thinks about it in the simpler and more direct terms of the man who is supposed to be at this junction, and who is the only man available to be at this junction, and who is therefore the man who is at this junction, regardless of the arithmetic of what one man can do against the column that is making those sounds. The junction controls access to the N23, the highway that Kampfgruppe Piper of the 1st SS Panzer Division needs to continue its drive west toward the Meuse River crossings. If the junction is undefended, Piper's column moves through it. If the junction is defended, or if the column commander believes it is defended, which is a different thing, but produces the same operational result, the column stops. A stopped Panzer column in December 1944 is a column that the American recovery operation has more time to organize against. Hensel understands this. He does not think about it in these terms. He thinks about it in the terms of a staff sergeant who is alone at a road junction in the dark and who has decided not to move. The Battle of the Bulge, which the German High Command calls Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, and which will eventually be known as the largest battle in American military history, involving approximately 600,000 American soldiers, is 2 days old when Hensel finds himself alone at the Amblève Junction. The German offensive has put 250,000 men through the 85-mile Ardennes front in the first 24 hours, driving the American 99th Infantry Division and the 106th Infantry Division back from their positions in the specific and violent way of an assault that has been planned with the specific detail and the specific operational security that has prevented the American intelligence system from projecting it as achievable on this timeline. The 106th Infantry Division in the worst single American military disaster of the European theater, is in the process of having 2 of its 3 infantry regiments surrounded in the Schnee-Eifel salient, approximately 7,000 men, who will surrender on December 19th, in the largest American surrender in the European theater since Bastogne. The 99th Infantry Division, holding the Eisenhower Ridge in conditions that its 6 weeks of European service have not prepared it for, is holding anyway, holding against the 1st SS and 12th SS Panzer Divisions, with the specific and documented courage of soldiers doing something they were not specifically trained to do against opponents who have been doing this specific thing for 5 years. The rear areas through which the German penetration's leading elements are now driving, through which Piper's column is driving, are the rear areas of divisions that were not expecting to be rear areas under attack, and the units in them are the supply units and the replacement depots, and the engineer battalions, and the military police, and the signal corps teams whose combat training has been calibrated for rear area security, rather than for the defense of road junctions against panzer columns. The 1st SS Panzer Division's Kampfgruppe Piper, the most dangerous single tactical formation in the German offensive, built around the heavy tanks of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, including the massive King Tiger, whose 88mm gun can defeat any Allied tank at any combat range, and whose 70-ton weight gives it the specific and terrible presence of a vehicle that the frozen Belgian roads can barely support, and that nothing the engineer units have placed in its path has been able to stop. And the Panzer Grenadier Battalion, whose motorized infantry accompanies the armor in the specific and integrated way that the German combined arms doctrine has been refining since 1939, has been advancing west along the northern edge of the penetration since December 16th, leaving behind at Malmedy and Baugnes the specific and documented crime of the 84 American prisoners of war, whose execution by the 1st SS will produce the unit's post-war prosecution, and whose deaths have been reported to the American command in the first hours of December 17, and whose reporting has produced in the American units in Piper's path the specific knowledge that surrender is not an option to be considered. Piper's column includes approximately 4,000 men, 72 tanks, 30 half-tracks, and a battery of self-propelled guns whose combined firepower exceeds the armament of some infantry divisions. It is moving toward the Meuse River. Its route takes it through the Amblève Valley. Its route takes it through the N23 and the Trois Ponts Road intersection, where Hensel is standing. The gap between what Piper's column represents and what Hensel represents, the gap between 4,000 armed men in Tiger II tanks and 1 man with a carbine and 2 grenades, is the gap that the Battle of the Bulge's first 48 hours is full of, in the specific and unremarked form of individual American soldiers who are alone in the dark at positions that are supposed to be defended by formations that have been swept away by the advance. The individual American soldier in December 1944 is the product of a military training system that has been accelerating its output since 1942, and that has been producing in the men who have been in the European theater long enough for the accelerated training to have been supplemented by combat experience, a specific and documented quality that the German professional military's own assessments have been reluctantly acknowledging since the first Tunisia engagements in early 1943. The quality of soldiers who have been trained in a military culture that values individual initiative and individual judgment in ways that the German military's own culture, built on the specific and hierarchical professionalism of the Prussian military tradition, has not fully anticipated as a combat capability. The German military's strength is the trained professional judgment of its unit cohesion, soldiers who perform excellently in the organized context of the formation they belong to. The American military's strength is increasingly the trained professional judgment of the individual, the soldier who can make the right decision when the formation has been swept away and the individual is alone at the junction. Hensel is that soldier. He has to decide, without guidance and without support, what a soldier alone at a position does when the force coming toward him exceeds by every calculable factor what any rational assessment of the situation says can be opposed. The question that the American soldiers alone in the dark in December 1944 have to answer is not whether they can stop the column. The question is whether they are going to try. The question is the question that the training has been preparing them for, without telling them it was preparing them for this. Every field exercise that has placed a soldier in a situation where the force opposing him exceeds what the available weapons can physically overcome, and whose resolution has depended on the soldier's judgment about what the available weapons can achieve, that the physical calculus does not capture. The deception, the delay, the creation of uncertainty in the opponent that buys the time that the physical weapons cannot buy, has been preparing this soldier for this question. The answer that the training has been building toward is the answer that Hensel gives at 02:15 hours on December 17, 1944. He stays. Staff Sergeant Charles Hensel of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion is 24 years old. He was a construction worker in Ohio before the Army, a man whose professional life before the war has been spent moving material in the physical world, making things that did not exist, and removing things that existed. The Army has given him a different version of the same work, building what the Army needs to advance, and destroying what the Army needs to deny to the opponent, in the specific and sequential way of combat engineering that constructs and demolishes on the same timeline for opposite purposes. He has a specific professional history that has produced in him the specific and particular kind of soldier who answers the question of what one man at a road junction does in the dark when he hears a panzer column coming in the way, that the Ardennes winter's darkness is about to require him to answer it. The 291st Engineer Combat Battalion is one of the Army's specialized combat engineering units. The units whose mission is not merely construction and bridge building, but the specific combination of construction, demolition, and combat capability that the European theater's fluid combat has been requiring since the Normandy landing. The 291st has been building and destroying infrastructure across France and Belgium since the Normandy landing, working in the specific conditions of a combat engineer unit, in the dark, under fire, with the specific time pressure of an operational timeline that does not stop for the weather, or the fear, or the casualties that the work produces. The 291st has built bridges under fire in Normandy while German artillery fired on the bridge sites. It has cleared minefields in the Norman bocage while German snipers worked the hedgerows. It has demolished road junctions and bridges in the retreat from the Ardennes' initial German assault in conditions whose chaos the unit's after-action reports describe, with the specific and professional understatement of military documentation that records what happened rather than what it was like to be happening through it. The 291st has been the instrument of the American Army's engineering effort in the European theater's most difficult 6 months, and its NCO Corps, the sergeants who manage the specific and technical work of combat engineering in the field, are the product of 6 months of exactly this kind of experience, whose specific and hardening quality has been noted in the unit's efficiency reports and in the letters home that the soldiers have been writing to families who have only partial understanding of what the experience has been. Hensel has been doing this work since Normandy. He has been doing it in the specific and hardening way that doing dangerous work continuously for 6 months hardens the men who survive it. Not hardening them to the danger, but hardening their professional judgment about what the danger requires. Calibrating their assessment of what they can do against what the situation demands, in a way that men who have been in the situation for 6 months can calibrate, and men who have not, cannot. A man who has been a combat engineer for 6 months in the European theater has a specific and functional understanding of what explosive charges can and cannot do, what demolition timelines look like under fire, what the difference between a bridge that has been prepared for demolition and a bridge that has been blown actually means in the operational situation that the bridge's destruction or survival produces downstream. He has an equally specific and functional understanding of what one man at a junction can and cannot do, cannot stop a panzer column in any physical sense, can potentially convince a panzer column commander in the dark that the junction is defended in a way whose investigation will take time. And time in the Ardennes in December 1944 is the resource that matters more than any other resource available to any individual American soldier at any individual position. He is alone at the junction. He is not moving. December 17th, 1944. 02:15 hours. The tank sounds are closer now. Close enough that Hensel can hear the individual sounds within the composite sound. The track clatter, the engine note, the occasional metallic squeal of a track link on a particularly cold section of road. He identifies from the sound pattern that there is more than one vehicle. The overlapping track sounds and the multiple engine notes produce the specific and composite sound of a formation rather than a single vehicle. And his 6 months of engineering work, that has included 6 months of listening to armored vehicles of both armies from varying distances, has given him the ability to distinguish what the sound's composition is suggesting about the force that is producing it. He cannot determine how many vehicles. The overcast Ardennes sky produces no light below the cloud layer, and the road that the column is approaching on curves in the specific and unhelpful way of Belgian country roads, whose alignment has been determined by the terrain features of the terrain, rather than the grid geometry that would make distance estimation from sound reliable. In the darkness of the Belgian Ardennes, with no light available from any source, the road's blackout conditions, the village of Trois Ponts 4 kilometers to the west, whose own blackout has been in effect since the offensive began, the farmhouses whose occupants have been in their cellars since the sound of German artillery first reached the valley on December 16th. Hensel cannot see the column. The column cannot see him. The darkness is the one advantage that one man at a junction has against a panzer column. What the column can see, can hear, rather, is the sound that Hensel produces with the specific and deliberate actions he has decided to take. He fires his carbine 3 times in the direction of the approaching sound, not at any identified target, but in the general direction of the sound, in the specific tactical calculation of a man who is trying to produce in the column commander the specific impression that the junction is defended, rather than the specific impression that the junction is undefended. The calculation is the calculation of deception rather than combat. One man cannot stop a panzer column. One man can potentially convince a panzer column that the junction is defended, and a convinced panzer column that believes the junction is defended produces the same operational result, a halt, as an actual defended junction. The column stops. The lead vehicle, a half-track carrying the reconnaissance element that has been moving ahead of the main panzer column in the specific and standard German advance formation, whose purpose is exactly this: to identify defensive positions before the column's most valuable vehicles are committed to the approach, stops with the specific and immediate response of soldiers who have been trained to halt and assess when fire is received from an unidentified position, rather than to continue and run into an ambush whose dimensions are unknown. In the darkness of the Belgian Ardennes at 02:15 hours on December 17th, with the overcast sky producing the specific and impenetrable blackness of a December night without stars or moon, the reconnaissance element's commander cannot determine what is at the junction. He knows there is fire coming from the junction. He cannot determine the caliber. The carbine's report in the cold night air produces a sound whose distance and direction are clear, but whose weapon identification is ambiguous, in the specific way that small arms fire in the dark is ambiguous to a listener who is not familiar with the acoustic characteristics of every weapon in both armies' inventories. He cannot determine the number of weapons firing. Multiple shots from one weapon or one shot from multiple weapons produces the same acoustic signature in the dark at 50 meters. He knows what he does not know. A commander who does not know what he is facing in the dark reports to his superior that he does not know, and the superior acts on that report in a way that the report's uncertainty warrants. The column stops. The near failure in Hensel's one-man defense arrives at approximately 02:40 hours, when the column's commander dispatches a reconnaissance patrol to the junction to determine what is holding it. The patrol, 2 men with submachine guns, moving carefully on the road verge in the specific way of soldiers who have been told there is an armed force at the junction and who are approaching with the caution that the information warrants, reaches to within 50 meters of Hensel's position before he can hear them moving on the road surface. The specific and terrible problem of the patrol is that it represents the discovery mechanism whose success means Hensel's deception has failed, and the column resumes its advance. Hensel throws one of his 2 fragmentation grenades in the direction of the patrol's sound. The grenade detonates. He cannot determine what it has hit. The patrol does not continue its approach. The reconnaissance result that reaches the column commander is ambiguous in the specific way that grenade detonations in the dark produce ambiguous reconnaissance results. There is definitely a force at the junction, and that force has both small arms and grenades, and the patrol has not been able to determine the force's size. The column commander makes the decision that the ambiguous intelligence and the specific operational timeline of the Ardennes offensive have produced in him. He radios back to Piper's headquarters that the junction is defended and that the northern approach to the Amblève Valley is contested. He requests guidance. The guidance does not arrive immediately. The column waits. The column waits for 2 hours and 17 minutes. 2 hours and 17 minutes whose passage Hensel tracks by the watch that his father has given him before his deployment, and that he has been keeping in his jacket pocket for 6 months, in the specific and superstitious way of soldiers who believe that a particular object, whose continued presence marks their continued survival, must be kept in the same place it has always been kept. The watch shows 0215 when the first shots bring the column to a halt. It shows 0240 when the patrol approaches. It shows 0255 when the grenade detonates and the patrol stops approaching. It shows 0437 when the first jeep arrives from the west and the 230th Division soldiers take positions at the junction, and Hensel, for the first time since his team was dispersed, is not alone at this junction. 2 hours and 17 minutes, during which the American recovery operation that Eisenhower has been driving with the full authority of the Supreme Allied Commander, is using every minute that the halt has provided. The 82nd Airborne Division's advance elements that Eisenhower has ordered to the Ardennes in the first hours of December 17 are moving through the dark Belgian roads toward the positions that will seal the northern shoulder of the penetration. The 30th Infantry Division's units are being redirected from their rest positions to blocking positions in the Amblève Valley, whose defense will eventually halt the Piper column's advance, with a thoroughness that one man with a carbine cannot achieve, but that one man with a carbine has provided the time to organize, and the combat engineers of the 111th Engineer Group, whose demolition teams have been destroying the bridges that Piper needs intact to continue his advance, are doing their work in the specific and desperate time pressure of men who know that the bridges must be blown before the column reaches them, and who know that the column is very close. 2 hours and 17 minutes, during which the junction that one man has been defending with a carbine and a single remaining grenade is edging toward the specific and concrete defense that arriving American reinforcements will eventually provide. At 0437 hours, a jeep containing 2 soldiers from the 30th Infantry Division's reconnaissance troop arrives at Hensel's position from the west, the first American military presence at the junction other than Hensel himself since his team was dispersed, arriving in the specific way that the 30th Infantry Division's movement orders have been generating small advance elements in the dark toward the positions that the division's command has identified as critical to the blocking mission. The 2 soldiers in the jeep find Hensel at the junction with his carbine and his single remaining grenade, and the specific and composed manner of a man who has been alone at a defended position for 2.5 hours and has converted the loneliness into something that resembles, from the outside, the composure of a man who is not aware of being alone. He briefs them on the German column's position, the patrol's approach, the grenade's effect. They take positions. At 0512 hours, 12 men of a platoon from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, reach the junction from the north, moving in the specific and rapid way of paratroopers who have been given a blocking mission and who understand that the time between the mission's assignment and the mission's execution is the time during which the junction they are supposed to block might be taken by the force it is supposed to be blocking. At 0545 hours, the junction has a garrison of 15 men with rifles, a machine gun whose crew has established a field of fire covering the eastern approach, and a bazooka team, whose position has been selected by Hensel's specific knowledge of the junction's geometry, that the paratroopers arriving without prior reconnaissance of the site do not possess. The deception has lasted long enough for the defense to become real. The legacy of what one sergeant did at a road junction in the Omblève Valley on December 17, 1944, is not the legacy of a battle. It is not the legacy of an engagement that military historians include in the standard accounts of the Battle of the Bulge, alongside the defense of Bastogne, and the Eisenhower Ridge, and the Malmedy massacre, and the Piper Column's final fuel failure at Stavelot. It is the legacy of a decision, the specific and private decision of a man who had every rational justification for leaving, and who did not leave, made in the darkness of a Belgian December by a man who was not thinking about the Battle of the Bulge's strategic outcome, or about the Meuse River crossings, or about the timeline of the American recovery operation, but who was thinking about his junction, and his road, and the tank sounds that were getting louder, and what a soldier alone at a position does when he decides not to move. The legacy is preserved in the records of two military institutions whose assessments of the same event describe it from opposite sides. The American record, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion's after-action report, the 30th Infantry Division's movement order, the 82nd Airborne's account of the Omblève Valley positions, describes the junction's defense in the terms that military record-keeping uses for combat actions of this kind. A summary of events, a list of personnel present, an assessment of the tactical situation's contribution to the broader operational outcome. The German record is more interesting, and it is the German record that is responsible for the title that the historical documentation has given this action. The Kampfgruppe Piper after-action report of December 17 and 18, the document that Piper's headquarters staff produces in the hours after the column has been held at the Omblève Junction and has been redirected on an alternate route, that adds 6 hours to the schedule and takes the column to the Stavelot Bridge, whose fuel dumps American engineers will burn before the column can secure them, describes the force at the junction as of unknown strength and significant capability. The report says, in the German professional military's specific and careful language of operational assessment, the junction at the Omblève N23 intersection was defended by a force whose strength could not be determined and whose defensive capability prevented the column's advance for a period that the reconnaissance assessment was unable to attribute to a force of identifiable size. The initial contact produced fire from the junction at approximately 02:15 hours. Reconnaissance patrol dispatched at 02:40 hours encountered grenade fire at 50 meters and sustained unknown casualties. The patrol reported 2 men unaccounted for at its recall, whose status was not determined before the column's movement was redirected. The fire from the junction continued at irregular intervals throughout the period of the halt, suggesting either a well-disciplined force maintaining fire control or a force whose size was insufficient for sustained fire and was managing its ammunition accordingly. The unit defending the junction has not been identified. No prisoners were taken. The defensive force appears to have consisted of fewer men than the defense's effectiveness would suggest was necessary for a position of this importance. The column commander's assessment, which he delivers to Piper in the specific and professional language that the German after-action reporting system requires, is that the position was held by a ghost, by an American defensive force whose military effect exceeded what any identifiable military formation at the junction could have produced on the available evidence, and whose actual composition was therefore not determinable from the available evidence. The column commander's assessment is the most operationally accurate assessment of the event that any record has produced. The junction was held by a ghost, by a force whose presence was real, in the sense that the fire it produced was real, and the grenades it threw were real, and the halt it produced was real, and whose composition was something that no military planning assessment in any army of any nation in December 1944 would project as adequate for the task it accomplished. 1 man, 1 carbine, 2 fragmentation grenades, 6 months of engineering experience in the European theater, and the specific decision not to move. These are the components of the force that held the Omblève N23 junction for 2 hours and 17 minutes. against the 1st SS Panzer Division's advance element, and provided the American recovery operation the time it needed to begin the defensive organization that eventually halted the Piper column at Stoumont and La Glaise. The column that stopped at Hensel's junction never crossed the Meuse. Piper's force was surrounded at La Glaise on December 23 and abandoned its vehicles and withdrew on foot on December 24th, leaving behind 135 tanks and armored vehicles, and the operational plan that the entire Ardennes offensive had been built around. The strategic failure of the Ardennes offensive is a product of many factors and many decisions and many individual actions across an 85-mile front and a month of fighting. Among those factors, in the specific and documented way that every individual decision that changes the timing of a military operation changes the operation's outcome, is the 2 hours and 17 minutes that one man with a carbine produced at a road junction in the Amblève Valley. The ghost held the junction held the road held the time that the American recovery needed and that the Battle of the Bulge's outcome required. The time between the first tank sounds and the first jeep from the west. The 2 hours and 17 minutes, whose value in the operational arithmetic of December 1944 exceeded the value of any single weapon system or any single operational decision made above the level of one staff sergeant deciding not to move. The time that one man provided became the time that 15 men used, and the time that 15 men held became the time that a division occupied, and the time that a division occupied became one part of the reason that the Panzer column never crossed the Meuse. Individual human decision, the specific and unremarked decision of one man at one junction in the dark, has always been the smallest irreducible unit of military history, the thing that the grand strategic narratives are built from, and that the grand strategic narratives have always insufficiently credited. And the man at the junction in the dark who decides not to move when every calculable factor says moving is the only rational option is the man who proves, every time, that the calculable factors are not the only factors, and that the factor that is not calculable is the one that most often decides the outcome.